There's a moment that comes in every life, a moment so subtle you might miss it if you're not paying attention. It's the moment when you walk into a room and something shifts. The air changes. Conversations pause, just for a heartbeat. Eyes meet yours and then look away, not out of disrespect, but out of something deeper, something more primal. It's not that people dislike you. It's not that they're angry with you. It's something far more profound than that. They fear you. And the strange thing is, you didn't have to raise your voice. You didn't have to threaten anyone. You didn't have to prove anything at all. You simply mastered something that most people spend their entire lives running from. Something that Niccolò Machiavelli understood 5 centuries ago when he sat in his study, exiled from power, and wrote the words that would echo through history. What is this thing that creates such a strange and powerful effect? What did Machiavelli know that transforms an ordinary person into someone who commands a room without saying a word? The answer isn't what you think. It's not about being cruel. It's not about manipulation or deception or playing games with people's emotions. It's something far more elegant and far more terrifying in its simplicity. It's about mastering the one thing that most human beings cannot master, the one thing that betrays us in our weakest moments and controls us in ways we don't even realize. Machiavelli called it many things throughout his work, but at its core, it's the mastery of emotional detachment. Now, before you recoil at that phrase, before you imagine some cold, heartless sociopath devoid of feeling, let me pull you deeper into what this really means. Because emotional detachment, in the Machiavellian sense, is not about becoming a robot. It's not about killing your emotions or pretending you don't feel anything. It's about something far more sophisticated than that. It's about understanding that your emotions, while real and valid, are not you. They are signals, information, data flowing through your consciousness. And the person who can observe their own emotions without being consumed by them, who can feel anger without acting from anger, who can experience fear without being paralyzed by fear, who can feel desire without being enslaved by desire. That person becomes something that society is not equipped to handle. Think about it for a moment. Really think about it. How many decisions have you made in your life that were driven purely by emotion? How many words have you spoken in anger that you wished you could take back? How many opportunities have you missed because fear whispered in your ear that you weren't ready, that you weren't good enough, that you should wait just a little longer? How many relationships have you ruined because you couldn't control the surge of jealousy or the sting of wounded pride? We are, all of us, puppets dancing on emotional strings most of the time, and we don't even realize it. We think we're making rational decisions. We think we're in control. But Machiavelli saw through this illusion 500 years ago. He watched as princes and popes, merchants and soldiers, all fell victim to the same predictable patterns. They acted from emotion and called it principle. They reacted from fear and called it caution. They succumbed to flattery and called it respect. They were led by their appetites and called it ambition. And because they were slaves to their emotions, they were predictable. And because they were predictable, they were controllable. And because they were controllable, they were ultimately powerless, no matter how many titles they held or how much gold sat in their treasuries. But every now and then, Machiavelli encountered someone different. Someone who could sit in a negotiation and watch as others grew heated, could observe the anger rising in the room like a fever, and remain perfectly crystalline calm. Someone who could be insulted to their face and simply smile, not out of weakness, but out of a deep understanding that the insult revealed more about the insulter than the insulted. Someone who could be offered everything they claim to want and still have the clarity to see the trap hidden beneath the gift. These people, Machiavelli noted, were feared. Not hated, not always liked, but universally feared. And fear, he understood, was a far more reliable foundation for influence than love could ever be. Now, let's go deeper into why this is true. Why does emotional mastery create fear in others? The answer lies in something uncomfortable, something most people don't want to acknowledge. Human beings are conditioned from birth to read emotions in others. We learn to recognize the micro-expressions on our mother's face, to understand when father is pleased or disappointed, to navigate the social world by reading the emotional states of those around us. This ability is so fundamental to our survival as social creatures that we do it automatically, unconsciously, constantly. We are emotion-reading machines. And we use this information to predict behavior, to know how to approach someone, to understand where we stand in the social hierarchy, to sense danger or opportunity. But what happens when you encounter someone whose emotions you cannot read? What happens when you try to use your well-honed social instincts to understand someone and you find nothing to grasp onto? What happens when anger doesn't provoke a defensive reaction? When flattery doesn't produce visible pleasure, when threat doesn't generate obvious fear? Something in the human psyche short circuits. We become uncertain. And uncertainty, in the realm of human interaction, breeds fear. Think of it this way. Imagine you're walking through a forest at night and you hear something moving in the darkness. If you can identify the sound, a deer, a rabbit, even a known predator, you can assess the threat and respond appropriately. But if the sound is completely alien, if it follows no pattern you recognize, if you cannot categorize it or predict what it will do next, the fear multiplies exponentially. This is what you become when you master emotional detachment. You become unpredictable, not erratic or random, but genuinely unpredictable, because the normal emotional triggers that govern human behavior no longer govern you. Machiavelli saw this principle play out again and again in the political theater of Renaissance Italy. He watched Cesare Borgia, the man he both admired and feared, use this very quality to dominate his enemies. Borgia could be ruthless when ruthlessness served his purpose, and merciful when mercy was strategically valuable. And the terrifying thing was that no one could tell which version they would encounter. He didn't act from rage or compassion. He acted from calculation. And that calculation was impossible to predict because it wasn't rooted in emotion. It was rooted in situational analysis. You couldn't manipulate Borgia by making him angry or by appealing to his sympathy because those emotions, while present in him, were not in control of him. But let's bring this out of the Renaissance palaces and into your life, right now, today. Because this isn't just historical theory. This is practical wisdom that changes everything once you truly understand it. When you master emotional detachment, when you develop the ability to observe your emotions without being controlled by them, several things begin to happen in your social interactions. First, people can no longer manipulate you using emotional tactics. The person who tries to make you angry in order to get you to say something you'll regret finds that you simply don't take the bait. The person who tries to use guilt to control your decisions discovers that guilt doesn't work on you the way it works on others. The person who tries to impress you or seduce you with status signals finds that you're completely unmoved by the usual displays. And here's where it gets interesting. When people realize they cannot manipulate you emotionally, they have only two choices. They can either respect you and deal with you honestly, or they can fear you and keep their distance. Most choose fear because honest dealing requires vulnerability, and most people are not comfortable being vulnerable with someone they cannot read. So they begin to treat you differently. They speak more carefully around you. They think twice before trying to deceive you. They become aware that you see things that others miss, that you notice the inconsistencies in their stories, that you recognize when they're acting from emotion rather than reason. This is not about being cold or cruel. In fact, the person who has truly mastered emotional detachment can be warmer and more genuinely compassionate than someone who is ruled by their emotions. Why? Because their compassion is not a reaction, it's a choice. They help others not because guilt or social pressure forces them to, but because they have consciously decided that helping serves their values and their purpose. This makes their kindness more reliable, more trustworthy, even if it also makes it more disconcerting to those who are used to manipulating others through emotional appeals. Machiavelli understood something that modern psychology has only recently begun to confirm through research. The brain's emotional centers, particularly the amygdala, can hijack our decision-making processes in milliseconds. When we encounter a threat or an opportunity, our emotional brain reacts before our rational brain even knows what's happening. This is why we say things in anger that we don't mean, why we make impulsive purchases we later regret, why we stay in relationships that are clearly toxic. The emotional brain is fast, powerful, and often wrong. But it feels so right in the moment, so urgent, so true. The person who masters emotional detachment has learned to insert a pause between stimulus and response. When someone insults them, there's a pause before they react. In that pause, they can ask themselves, what is this person trying to accomplish? Why are they attempting to provoke me? What do I actually want to achieve in this situation? And is an emotional reaction going to serve that goal or undermine it? This pause, this tiny gap of conscious awareness, is what separates the master from the puppet. And people sense this. They sense that you're not reacting mechanically to their emotional provocations. They sense that you're operating from a different level of consciousness than they are. And that difference is profoundly unsettling to them. Let me paint you a picture to make this concrete. Imagine two men in a business negotiation. The stakes are high. One man is trying to buy the other's company. The buyer tries every tactic he knows. He starts by flattering the seller, praising his business acumen, his vision, his success. The seller smiles but remains neutral. The buyer then shifts tactics, suggesting that the market is turning, that the window of opportunity is closing, trying to create urgency and fear. The seller acknowledges the information but shows no sign of panic. The buyer then makes a lowball offer, watching carefully for a reaction. Anger, disappointment, offense. The seller simply asks a clarifying question, betraying nothing. Finally, in frustration, the buyer raises his voice slightly, showing irritation. And the seller remains perfectly calm, even slightly amused. What's happening in this interaction? The buyer is throwing every emotional card he has at the seller, and none of them are landing. The seller is not emotionally numb. He's registering all of these tactics, understanding them, seeing through them, but he's not being controlled by them. And the buyer, who has built his entire negotiation strategy on emotional manipulation, suddenly realizes he's outmatched. Not because the seller is smarter or more knowledgeable about business, but because the seller has mastered something the buyer hasn't. The seller has mastered himself. And in that moment, whether the buyer would articulate it this way or not, he fears the seller. He fears him because he cannot control him. He fears him because he cannot predict him. He fears him because he has encountered something rare and powerful, a person who is not a puppet. This is what Machiavelli was pointing to when he wrote about the prince who is feared rather than loved. He wasn't advocating for cruelty. He was observing a truth about human nature. People who are loved are people who fulfill our emotional needs, who make us feel good, who validate us, who give us what we want. But the moment you stop fulfilling those needs, the moment you say no, the moment you set a boundary, that love can evaporate instantly because it was conditional from the beginning. Fear, on the other hand, is based not on what you give to others, but on what you are. It's based on the recognition that you operate from a level of consciousness that is not easily manipulated or controlled. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds lonely. This sounds like a path to isolation. If people fear you, won't that push them away? Won't you end up alone? And this is where we need to distinguish between healthy fear and toxic fear. Toxic fear is what abusers and tyrants create. Fear based on unpredictable violence, arbitrary cruelty, the constant threat of harm. This kind of fear does indeed isolate and eventually destroys both the feared and those who fear them. But healthy fear, the kind that Machiavelli actually admired, is different. It's the fear that comes from respect, from the recognition that you are dealing with someone of substance, someone who cannot be trifled with, someone who sees through the games that most people play. Think about the people you respect most in your life. If you're honest, there's probably an element of healthy fear in that respect. You wouldn't want to disappoint them. You wouldn't want to lie to them because you know they'd see through it. You wouldn't want to betray them because you understand there would be real consequences, not out of revenge, but out of their unwillingness to tolerate betrayal. This healthy fear doesn't push you away from them. It actually draws you closer because you know that your relationship with them is based on truth rather than manipulation, on authenticity rather than performance. Machiavelli observed that the most successful leaders, the ones whose power endured, were those who cultivated this healthy fear while also being respected for their fairness and their strength. They were not loved in the sense of being popular or universally liked, but they were feared in the sense that people understood they operated from principle rather than emotion, from strength rather than reactivity. And paradoxically, this made them more reliable, more trustworthy than leaders who were desperate to be loved and would compromise their principles to maintain popularity. So how does one actually master this? How does one develop emotional detachment in a world that is constantly trying to provoke emotional reactions? This is not a skill you acquire overnight. It's a practice, a discipline, something you build gradually over time through conscious effort and repeated experience. It begins with awareness. You must first become aware of your own emotional patterns. When do you get angry? What triggers your fear? What makes you defensive? What activates your pride? These patterns are unique to each person, shaped by our individual histories, our traumas, our conditioning. You cannot master something you're not aware of. So the first step is always observation. Machiavelli himself developed this observational skill through his years in the Florentine government, watching power players make moves, succeed, and fail. He learned to see patterns that others missed because he was observing not just the actions, but the emotional states that drove those actions. He could predict that a leader driven by wounded pride would make reckless decisions to restore his reputation. He could foresee that a negotiator desperate for approval would cave to pressure at the critical moment. And this ability to read others came from his ability to read himself. to understand his own emotional machinery well enough that he wasn't constantly surprised by his own reactions. The second step after awareness is creating space. This is what I mentioned earlier, the pause between stimulus and response. When something happens that would normally trigger an emotional reaction, you practice pausing, not suppressing the emotion, not pretending you don't feel it, but simply observing it. You feel the anger rising and you think, there's anger. Interesting. Why is this activating anger? What is this anger trying to protect? What is it afraid of? You treat your emotions like information rather than commands. They're data points that tell you something about your values, your fears, your desires. But they're not orders that you must obey immediately. This practice is uncomfortable at first because we're so conditioned to react immediately to our emotions. We feel anger and we speak sharply. We feel fear and we retreat. We feel desire and we reach out. The idea of feeling these things and not immediately acting on them feels unnatural, almost wrong. But with practice, that pause becomes easier. You begin to notice that most emotional reactions, if you wait even 60 seconds, begin to lose their urgency. The anger that felt absolutely justified and necessary when it first spiked starts to seem less clear-cut after a minute of observation. The fear that felt overwhelming begins to reveal itself as perhaps exaggerated or even entirely unfounded. The third step is developing emotional literacy. This means expanding your vocabulary for emotions and learning to distinguish between different emotional states that you might have previously lumped together. For instance, what you might call anger could actually be disappointment or frustration or hurt or fear or wounded pride. Each of these requires a different response. True anger at injustice might call for action. Wounded pride might call for reflection on why your ego is so fragile. Fear might call for courage, or it might call for caution, depending on whether the fear is rational or irrational. By becoming more precise in your emotional understanding, you become less likely to be swept away by emotional storms that you've misidentified. Machiavelli demonstrated this emotional literacy in his writing. He could distinguish between the genuine love that subjects might feel for a just ruler and the sycophantic flattery that courtiers offer to gain favor. He could tell the difference between strategic mercy that strengthens a leader's position and weak sentimentality that invites exploitation. This precision came from years of careful observation and self-reflection. And it's this precision that gave his advice its power. He wasn't making sweeping generalizations about human nature. He was making specific, nuanced observations about specific emotional patterns in specific contexts. Now here's where mastering emotional detachment becomes truly transformative. Once you've developed awareness, created space between stimulus and response, and built emotional literacy, something remarkable happens. You begin to see the emotional patterns not just in yourself, but in everyone around you. You watch people at work, at home, in social situations, and you see them being puppeted by their emotions in real time. You watch someone get defensive because you accidentally triggered their insecurity. You watch someone become overly agreeable because they're desperate for approval. You watch someone become aggressive because they're actually terrified and overcompensating. And because you can see these patterns, because you understand the emotional mechanics at play, you become vastly more effective in your interactions. But, and this is crucial, you don't use this understanding to manipulate. That's where people misunderstand Machiavelli. They think his work was a manual for manipulation and deception. It wasn't. It was an analysis of power dynamics, a description of how things actually work beneath the surface of social niceties. The person who truly masters emotional detachment doesn't need to manipulate because they're operating from a position of genuine strength. They can afford to be honest. They can afford to be direct. They can afford to say no without elaborate justifications or emotional performances. And this honesty, paradoxically, is what people find most intimidating. This investigation, this journey into understanding your own patterns, is painful. There's no way around that. You have to face things you've been avoiding, feel things you've been suppressing, acknowledge truths about yourself and your past that aren't comfortable. This is why most people never do it. This is why emotional mastery is rare. Not because it's intellectually complex or requires special talent, but because it requires courage. The courage to be honest with yourself in ways that most people cannot bear. But on the other side of that pain lies something extraordinary. You discover that you are far more than you thought you were. You're not just this collection of reactions and patterns and wounds. You're the consciousness that can observe all of that, understand it, and choose to respond differently. You're the awareness that remains constant even as emotions arise and pass away. You're the presence that exists before thought, beneath identity, beyond the stories you've been telling yourself about who you are. And when you touch that place, when you stabilize in that awareness even briefly, everything changes. Not because the external world changes, but because your relationship to it changes. The things that used to trigger you lose their power. The people who used to control you through emotional manipulation can no longer reach you. The fears that used to paralyze you become just sensations moving through awareness. The desires that used to drive you compulsively become preferences you can take or leave. This is what Machiavelli discovered through his study of power, though he expressed it in political rather than spiritual terms. This is what makes you feared, not because you're dangerous to others, but because you become dangerous to the illusions that most people live within. You become someone who sees clearly, who cannot be controlled through the usual means, who operates from a center that doesn't shift with circumstances. And in a world where almost everyone is reactive, where almost everyone is being puppeted by their emotions and conditioning, the person who is not reactive stands out like a lighthouse in fog. People will fear you when you master this, because you represent a possibility they haven't actualized, a freedom they haven't claimed, a consciousness they haven't accessed. Your very existence challenges their comfortable stories about why they are the way they are, why they can't change, why they're stuck in patterns they claim to hate. You prove, simply by being, that another way is possible, that emotional mastery is achievable, that the cage they're living in isn't locked. They're just too afraid to try the door. But you'll also discover something beautiful. The fear you inspire in some will be matched by the recognition you inspire in others. Those who are ready, those who are doing their own work, those who are on their own journey toward mastery, they will recognize you instantly. And in that recognition, genuine connection becomes possible. Connection based not on emotional neediness or manipulation, but on mutual respect between two people who have both done the work of understanding themselves. These connections, rare as they are, make the entire journey worthwhile. Machiavelli died alone in exile, stripped of the political power he once wielded and analyzed so brilliantly. But his final letters suggest he found something more valuable than power. He found peace with himself. He found the freedom that comes from no longer needing external validation or control. he found that the mastery he'd been seeking in the political realm was ultimately about mastery of himself. And that mastery, once achieved, could never be taken from him, not by exile, not by poverty, not even by death. This is the final secret, the deepest truth about emotional mastery. It's not about controlling others. It's not even primarily about being more effective in the world, though that's a natural side effect. It's about discovering who you really are beneath all the conditioning, all the patterns, all the emotional reactivity. It's about coming home to yourself. And when you do that, when you find that stable center that doesn't move regardless of circumstances, people will sense it. They'll fear it because it challenges everything they believe about how humans must be. But they'll also respect it, be drawn to it, and some will be inspired by it to begin their own journey. The question is not whether you'll be feared. If you truly master emotional detachment, you will be. The question is whether you're willing to do the work required to achieve that mastery, knowing that it will change how people relate to you, knowing that it will cost you some relationships, knowing that it will require you to face everything about yourself you've been avoiding. Only you can answer that question. But if you do choose this path, if you commit to the practice of self-observation, honest investigation, and conscious choice, you'll discover a freedom that nothing in the external world can provide, and that nothing in the external world can take away. That is what Machiavelli knew. That is what he was really teaching beneath all his political analysis. And that is what makes you feared when you master it, not because you become dangerous, but because you become free. And freedom, genuine freedom, is the most threatening and most inspiring thing a human being can witness in another. If you are ready to ascend beyond your emotional limits, subscribe to Dark Psychology Ascent and master the hidden forces that control human behavior. New transformative insights every day. Your journey to unshakable power starts now.